of shelves with glass jars and cases, some round and others square, filled with all sorts of anatomical specimens. The doctor placed on a table a dozen or more jars containing, as he said, the matrices or wombs of every class of women. Nearly half of one of these cases was occupied exclusively with these specimens.
Some people keep trophies, some killers keep trophies. The trophies could include eyes, pieces of skin, organs, including the genital organs. There's a case in Hong Kong where a taxi driver killed a number of women and kept all their uteruses and kept them in glass jars in his flat. So it's perfectly feasible that this man has removed Eddowes' uterus as a trophy.
The most important thing about Tumblety, of course, is that he is a bisexual. He basically married at a very young age. A woman then turned out to be a prostitute, a woman who was actually being an active prostitute during their marriage. He finds this out by following her to a brothel. He then ends their relationship and basically, in his own words, turns against all womankind. I take it it's at that point where he then became more interested. He turned to men for sexual favours and hence began a whole new chapter to his life.
The sexual chapter involved another exotic figure, the best-selling English novelist Hall Caine. Caine's biographer stumbled on Tumblety's Ripper connections just as she had unearthed a cache of his letters to Caine.
Apparently, Tumblety, wherever he went, got a coterie of young men around him and appeared almost to bewitch them, and I think he bewitched Caine for a start. Their relationship was certainly close. It gives the impression of being close and passionate at one stage. And the final letters that Tumblety wrote from America are fairly explicit. They're going to be interpreted one way. But the impression was of a con man and of somebody very smooth, friendly and affectionate on the surface, and then just every so often there's something that's quite vicious or peremptory demands for money to be telegraphed to him and things like this, so that you could see that there was something rather nasty underneath.
More typical than such great romances were Tumblety's casual pickups, cruising the streets of whatever city he was passing through. Sexually, Tumblety was no lady killer. Psychologically, would a homosexual have committed a series of apparent sex murders?
There's nothing in terms of the evidence available at that time which show without a doubt that these were committed by somebody in a state of sexual arousal, say. There weren't actually objects inserted into the body. There was no evidence of semen at the scene of the crime. There is no evidence that shows definitively that this was committed due to sexual sadism.
But isn't it a simplistic suggestion that Tumblety turned his rage on the female sex out of mere resentment of his wife's infidelity?
A number of patients of mine who I've had under my care have actually believed that their wives have been unfaithful to them or indeed have been prostitutes, and have attacked them on that basis of what actually is a false and delusional belief. Now, if one wishes to speculate down in the hypothesis that he was psychotic, it is possible that his illness started with a delusional belief of infidelity in his wife and progressed further to a hatred involving all women as being unfaithful and betrayers of men who had to be punished.
As a Victorian serial killer, Tumblety's personality profile fits the expert opinion of those who study his modern counterparts. But what of the facts? We now know that Tumblety had a criminal record, and there's evidence that as a quack he had killed before. Unlike some other suspects, at least Tumblety was in London when all the attacks happened, and they stopped when he left. One of his indecency offences was committed on the day of the first murder. Other offences were all on the same days of the week as the other murders. We know the police were watching Batty Street and looking for an American doctor who went slumming in the East End. And we know that an American disappeared from the Batty Street lodgings after the discovery of a blood-stained shirt by his landlady on the night of the double murder. Further grounds for suspicion was Tumblety's pathological hatred of women. His early life as a canal-side pornographer fits the obscene pictures found in the abandoned bag. All the murders except one targeted the womb. Coroner Baxter had reported an American who was trying to buy uteruses, and Tumblety did have a collection of his own.
I think the accumulation of circumstantial evidence is beyond coincidence, and I feel fairly satisfied myself that we've found the man, we've found Jack the Ripper. But in fact, of course, as a policeman, I must say honestly that there wouldn't be enough to get him to a court of law and convicting him of murder.
But surely there'd have been enough for the police to hold him and get a confession out of the man, almost the only way to get a Victorian conviction. Tantalizingly, Littlechild hints at the existence of a thick police file on the American suspect. But for reasons we can only guess at, the large dossier on Tumblety he refers to has gone missing from Scotland Yard. And why, when the American papers had the full story, did the British press abandon it? News, even then, travelled far. Unless, perhaps, the story had been killed in Britain.
At the time, there was tremendous pressure on Scotland Yard to catch someone for these murders. Imagine their embarrassment when their prime suspect is arrested. He then is bailed and escapes. Imagine the embarrassment. Imagine how battered the credibility of CID would have been. Imagine how many careers would have been ruined. Now, what better way to avoid all of that embarrassment than just to forget the thing ever happened, to just let it go away, not to mention it, so it just slips away unnoticed. And that's exactly what happened. And let's be honest about it, if it wasn't for John Littlechild, it would still be unknown today.
Francis Tumblety is buried in a family plot in the graveyard at Rochester, New York, among the American Irish. Typically for such an elusive figure, his name is carved in one of its many various spellings, Tamuelty. And there's one last clue from beyond the grave.
When he died, the nuns who were cared for him in the final days at the St. John's Hospital in St. Louis made a personal inventory of the things actually on his body, and it included the things you'd expect from a flamboyant dresser: diamond cluster rings, gold pocket watch, several expensive pieces of jewellery, and then the final thing on the list, 2 imitation gold rings, value $3, identical to the 2 that were wrenched from Annie Chapman's fingers during the Whitechapel murders of 1888. The question, of course, are they the same rings? Very difficult to say, but is it possible that he carried these trophies with him for the rest of his life?